We're bored. We're all bored now. But has it ever occurred to you, Wally, that the process that creates this boredom that we see in the world now may very well be a self-perpetuating, unconscious form of brainwashing created by a world totalitarian government based on money, and that all of this is much more dangerous than one thinks, and it's not just a question of individual survival, Wally, but that somebody who's bored is asleep, and somebody who's asleep will not say no? See, I keep meeting these people. I mean, just a few days ago, I met this man whom I greatly admire. He's a Swedish physicist, Gustav Bjornstrand, and he told me that he no longer watches television, he doesn't read newspapers, and he doesn't read magazines. He's completely cut them out of his life because he really does feel that we're living in some kind of Orwellian nightmare now, and that everything that you hear now contributes to turning you into a robot. And when I was at Findhorn, I met this extraordinary English tree expert who had devoted his life to saving trees. Just got back from Washington, lobbying to save the redwoods. He's 84 years old. He always travels with a backpack because he never knows where he's going to be tomorrow. And when I met him at Findhorn, he said to me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "New York." He said, "Ah, New York, yes, that's a very interesting place. Do you know a lot of New Yorkers who keep talking about the fact that they want to leave but never do?" And I said, "Oh, yes." And he said, "Why do you think they don't leave?" I gave him different banal theories. He said, "Oh, I don't think it's that way at all." He said, "I think that New York is the new model for the new concentration camp, where the camp has been built by the inmates themselves, and the inmates are the guards, and they have this pride in this thing they've built. They've built their own prison, and so they exist in a state of schizophrenia, where they are both guards and prisoners, and as a result, they no longer have, having been lobotomized, the capacity to leave the prison they've made, or to even see it as a prison." And then he went into his pocket and he took out a seed for a tree and he said, "This is a pine tree." He put it in my hand and he said, "Escape before it's too late." See, actually for 2 or 3 years now, Chiquita and I have had this very unpleasant feeling that we really should get out. And we really should feel like Jews in Germany in the late 30s. Get out of here. Of course, the problem is where to go, because it seems quite obvious that the whole world is going in the same direction. See, I think it's quite possible that the 1960s represented the last burst of the human being before he was extinguished, and that this is the beginning of the rest of the future now, and that from now on there'll simply be all these robots walking around, feeling nothing, thinking nothing, and there'll be nobody left almost to remind them that there once was a species called a human being, with feelings and thoughts, and that history and memory are right now being erased, and soon nobody will really remember that life existed on the planet.
I'm going to talk about a failure of intuition that many of us suffer from. It's really a failure to detect a certain kind of danger. I'm going to describe a scenario that I think is both terrifying and likely to occur. And that's not a good combination, as it turns out. And yet, rather than be scared, most of you will feel that what I'm talking about is kind of cool. I'm going to describe how the gains we make in artificial intelligence could ultimately destroy us. And in fact, I think it's very difficult to see how they won't destroy us or inspire us to destroy ourselves. And yet, if you're anything like me, you'll find that it's fun to think about these things. And that response is part of the problem. Okay, that response should worry you. And if I were to convince you in this talk that we were likely to suffer a global famine, either because of climate change or some other catastrophe, and that your grandchildren or their grandchildren are very likely to live like this, you wouldn't think, interesting, I like this TED Talk. Okay. Famine isn't fun. Death by science fiction, on the other hand, is fun. And one of the things that worries me most about the development of AI at this point is that we seem unable to marshal an appropriate emotional response to the dangers that lie ahead. I'm unable to marshal this response, and I'm giving this talk.
You're already a cyborg. You don't even, well, most people don't realize they are already a cyborg.
Humans and electronics all interfacing, and constantly now, constantly connected.
Yes. Constantly.
The thing I'm going to tell you tonight is one of those things which seems nutty, it seems wildly improbable, but it wasn't just something that some of us, I wasn't alone in saying this, that some of us just said, oh, one day, oh, you know, maybe the world is a hologram. That's not the way it happened. The way it happened was exactly this way. When you eliminate everything that's impossible, whatever is left over must be the truth. So let me tell you a little bit about where we're going. Good. Okay. What is this thing which Sherlock Holmes might have eventually concluded after trying everything else? And the answer is that in a certain sense, in a certain peculiar sense, the world is a hologram. Now, not everybody knows what a hologram is here. You know, you've all seen these pictures which look three-dimensional. They're made out of a film, which is a flat piece of film. Nevertheless, they look fully three-dimensional. I'll tell you eventually what a hologram is. But the idea that the world is a hologram is a wild idea, or at least a seemingly wild idea. It all began with thinking about black holes.
This is the construct. It's our loading program. We can load anything from clothing to equipment, weapons, training simulations, anything we need.
Right now, we're inside a computer program?
Is it really so hard to believe? Your clothes are different, the plugs in your arms and head are gone. Your hair has changed. Your appearance now is what we call residual self-image. It is the mental projection of your digital self.
This isn't real.
What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain. This is the world that you know. The world as it was at the end of the 20th century. It exists now only as part of a neural interactive simulation that we call the Matrix. You've been living in a dream world, Neo. This is the world as it exists today. Welcome to the desert of the real. We have only bits and pieces of information, but what we know for certain is that at some point in the early 21st century, all of mankind was united in celebration. We marveled at our own magnificence as we gave birth to AI.
AI? You mean artificial intelligence?
A singular consciousness that spawned an entire race of machines.
But what about origins? The dominant and virtually unchallenged myth of our origin is either that God created us in 7 days along with all the rest of creation, or that the universe was born out of nothingness in a single moment for no reason. These are the two choices on the menu. Neither terribly compelling to rationalists, I dare say. Interesting to note that this scientific explanation, the universe sprang from nothing in a single instant, however we may think of it in terms of its veracity, notice that it's the limit case for credulity. You understand what I mean? I mean that if you can believe that, hell, you can believe anything.
They come from a dying world. They drift through the universe, pushed on by the solar winds. They adapt, and they survive. The function of all life is survival. Sleep, sleep, sleep. From deep space, sleep. The seed is planted. Sleep,
But when you look at the details of how these neurons, the system of mirror neurons, how it works, then the exciting discoveries unfold. So if I were studying your mirror neurons, what would happen is if I did an action that was just totally random, your mirror neurons would not fire. If I did an action which had kind of repetition to it even, you may not be able to figure out what I was intending to do after just one or two repetitions. But if I were to take an object that would signify to you what I was trying to do, like this bottle of water, just notice what your feeling is. So you may have noticed that the feeling was very different when I had a bottle in my hand versus when I was just moving my hand in a similar way. What that tells us is that when you know the intention behind an action, a different system in your brain is activated. We now know that that system involves the mirror neurons and other areas of the brain, so that what you do is you follow a sequence of action. And when you can predict that sequence, you can determine what the implication of that sequence is. So when I have a bottle in my hand, you know I will continue to drink like this, not toss it at you, for example. That ability to understand the sensory implications, that is what you're going to see, of the motor actions that you're perceiving, allows you to create a map in the mind, if you will, that's correlated with neural firing patterns in this mirror neurons superior temporal area complex that creates a neural representation, a neural map of my intention in your head. In other words, beyond just seeing behavior, we see the intention beneath the behavior from the very beginning. Now, that's how we create the human capacity to imitate behavior.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with the white shirt, the lady with the trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little, he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we'll try it once again. Here's the candid subject. Here comes the candid camera staff, 3 of them at least. And this man has apparently been in groups before. Now, here's a fella with his hat on in the elevator. First he makes a full turn to the rear and Charlie closes the door. A moment later, we'll open the door. Everybody's changed positions. Now we'll see if we can use... Now we'll see if we can use group pressure for some good. Now, in a moment, on Charlie Siegel, everybody turns forward. Notice they take off their hats. And now, do you think we could reverse the procedure? Watch.
When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University. It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator. Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator. Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you were instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts, and you increase the shock one step on each error.
That is incorrect. This one will be 195 volts.
The learner was hidden from the teacher by a partition.
Of course, this was all a simulation. Nothing was really happening. But the learner made very convincing sounds of pain as the shocks increased.
This will be at 3:30.
And Milgram found, surprisingly and rather horrifyingly, that the majority of people would actually go right to the very highest level if there was some pressure from a man in a white coat who said things like,
It's absolutely essential that you continue. Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me.
Go on.
Let me out.
in fact, about 65% of the people who he studied, who were normal volunteers from the ordinary population, actually gave the maximum number of volts.
This man was one of those 65%.
This one will be 195 volts. The correct one.
Let me out of here.
Slow. Dance.
Let me out of here. My heart bothers me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Responsible for it. Red. That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30. The correct phrase is rich
Let me out of
boy.
here. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out, I tell you. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me here.
The next phrase is
Let me
fast.
out. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Bird,
Let me
car,
out.
train, plane.
Eventually, the learner pretended to be unconscious.
Continue, teacher.
That is incorrect. This will be 3:45. The correct answer is fast, bird.
What we learned from that experiment is that people will actually do an awful lot when they're put under pressure from authority figures. And the problem is, of course, that when we obey the unjust authority figure, the person who gives us immoral commands, then, of course, awful things can go wrong.
You're already a cyborg. You don't even, well, most people don't realize they are already a cyborg.
Humans and electronics all interfacing, and constantly now, constantly connected.
Yes. Constantly.
There's a sort of a philosophic concept that a sufficiently advanced civilization will be able to create a simulation. Yeah, maybe you've answered this before. A simulation.
I've had so many simulation discussions, it's crazy.
Okay.
So, because in fact, it got to the point where basically every conversation was the AI/simulation conversation, and my brother and I finally agreed that we would ban such conversations if we were ever in a hot tub. Okay. That was like, because that really kills the magic.
Hot tub, so the idea is right. Any sufficiently advanced civilization could create a simulation that's like our existence. And so the theory follows that maybe we're in the simulation. Have you thought about this? And
a lot.
Are we?
Even in hot tubs?
To know,
so much so it had to be banned from a hot tub.
Okay.
It's not the sexiest conversation.
Are we in? Are we in?
I mean, I think here's, in my mind, like the strongest argument for us being in a simulation, probably being in a simulation, I think is the following. That 40 years ago, we had Pong, like 2 rectangles and a dot. That was what games were. Now, 40 years later, we have photorealistic 3D simulations with millions of people playing simultaneously, and it's getting better every year. And soon we'll have virtual reality, augmented reality. If you assume any rate of improvement at all, then the games will become indistinguishable from reality. Just indistinguishable. Even if that rate of advancement drops by 1,000 from what it is right now, then you just say, okay, well, let's imagine it's 10,000 years in the future, which is nothing in the evolutionary scale. So given that we're clearly on a trajectory to have games that are indistinguishable from reality, and those games could be played on any set-top box or on a PC or whatever, and there would probably be, billions of such, computers or set-top boxes, it would seem to follow that the odds that we're in base reality is 1 in billions.
It's okay. It's okay. The subject of this speech is a topic which has been discovered recently and which may not exist at all. I may be talking about something that does not exist. Therefore, I'm free to say everything or nothing. I, in my stories and novels, often write about counterfeit worlds, semi-real worlds, as well as deranged private worlds, inhabited often by just one person, while meantime the other characters either remain in their own worlds throughout or are somehow drawn into one of the peculiar ones. This theme occurs in the corpus of my 27 years of writing. At no time did I have a theoretical or conscious explanation for my preoccupation with these pluriform pseudo-worlds, but now I think I understand. What I was sensing was the manifold of partially actualized realities lying tangent to what evidently is the most actualized one, the one which the majority of us, by consensus gentium, agree on. Later that day, back home again, but still deeply under the influence of the sodium pentothal, I had a short, acute flash of recovered memory. Then, in mid-March, a month later, the total body of memories, intact and entire, began to return. You are free to believe me or to disbelieve, but please take my word on it that I am not joking. This is very serious, a matter of importance. At that time, I had no idea what I was seeing. It resembled nothing that I had ever heard described. It resembled plasmic energy. It had colors. It moved fast. It collected and then dispersed. But what it was, what he was, I am not sure even now. In other words, it's a common theme in my writing that a dark-haired girl shows up at the door of the protagonist and tells him that his world is delusional, that there's something false about it. Well, this did finally happen to me. I even knew that her hair would be black. I had an actual complete sense of what she would look like and what she would say. She did appear, she was a total stranger, and she did inform me of this fact, that some of my fictional works were in a literal sense true. I wrote out these dreams in novel after novel, story after story. To name two in which this prior ugly present obtained most clearly, I cite The Man in the High Castle and my 1974 novel about the U.S. as a police state called Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said. I'm going to be very candid with you. I wrote both novels based on fragmentary residual memories of such a horrid slave state world. People claim to remember past lives. I claim to remember a different, very different present life. I know of no one who has ever made this claim before, but I rather suspect that my experience is not unique. What perhaps is unique is the fact that I am willing to talk about it. We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this an alternative world branched off.
There is a very clear prediction that our most successful theory of nature makes, and that is that there are an enormous number, mind-bogglingly large number, of parallel realities, as real as this one, that have different consistent histories. So imagine a world where all of the laws of physics as we know them are obeyed, but different decisions were made along the way. Different decisions at the level of tiny microscopic particles, different decisions all the way up to what you chose to eat for lunch, and whether you chose to come to this session or not. Quantum mechanics makes a very specific prediction that all of those are as real as the thing that you remember. And this is bizarre, because we don't see those other things. But science has reached the point now where we can build machines that exploit those other worlds. So the way I think about it is that the shadows of these parallel worlds overlap with ours. And if we're smart enough, we can dive into them and grab their resources and pull them back into ours. This is what they look like. There are two of them. These are from our lab in Burnaby in British Columbia. From the outside, they look like giant black monoliths, big metal boxes, about 10 feet on a side, 12 feet tall. And they are powered, they have a fridge inside them, a refrigerator that cools these chips to almost absolute zero. Just a wisp, a fraction of a degree above absolute zero. Hundreds of times colder than interstellar space. Amongst the coldest and most isolated and extreme conditions that humans have ever been able to engineer. These fridges, interestingly enough, which are called pulse tube dilution refrigerators, have a thing called a pulse tube, which emits a sound roughly once per second, which sounds eerily like a heartbeat. So if you have the opportunity to stand next to one of these machines, it is an awe-inspiring thing, at least for me. It feels like an altar to an alien god. They really are impressive machines.
I need your help if I'm going to find it. I'll set it for an hour. Set the timer for 120 minutes.
Set it for 60, it's better.
120 minutes, Whit.
60 is safer, I'm setting it at 60.
Whit. 1, 2, 0.
120 minutes. Engage timer. Preparing user for download into simulation. Program link ready for download.
Square Signal 17 West Winston, Pasadena, Virginia.
Transference beginning. Download complete.
$0.05.
Excuse me?
You owe me $12.05. Listen, young man, I do not have all day.
Ferguson, anything wrong? John, are you okay?
Terribly sorry, ma'am. Someone will be right with you.
Chris Albert here with the Warrior Soul podcast, and yep, you've heard that trailer correctly. We have Mr. Tom Campbell on the podcast today. He's one of our more popular past guests that we've had on, and Tom believes that we live in a virtual reality, that these trees, all this stuff around me are bits of data that's being sent to my avatar, and my consciousness, actually, in your consciousness, it exists somewhere else, in some other dimension, some other universe, and that we're simply avatars, or like what you would consider an elf in a World of Warcraft game, and our consciousness is controlling our every move. And the thing about this is, because I know it sounds really, really far-fetched, but you got to remember that Tom is a physicist, and he wrote a book called My Big Toe, My Big Theory of Everything, where he lays down the logical underpinnings for why he believes we live in a virtual reality simulation.
The idea is that once the scientists, who I call the high priests of Western culture, because it's the high priests, of any culture, who tell us what to believe, what's right and what's wrong, what is, what's phony and what's real. So for our culture, Western culture, which is pretty much world culture these days, the Western culture is kind of spread everywhere. The high priests are the scientists. They're the ones that tell us, truth from falsehood. That's sort of their job. So when they get to the point that they say, yes, this is a virtual reality, then that has some very important philosophical consequences that will actually reach down and touch everybody. And those are that in order for this to be a virtual reality, that means that our reality is computed.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove.
Today we're going to be exploring the holographic model of reality and its implications for ourselves, our bodies, and the world around us. With me today is Michael Talbot, author of several books including Mysticism and the New Physics, Beyond the Quantum, Your Past Lives, and most recently, The Holographic Universe, as well as 3 novels. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Nice to be with you.
You know, one of the things that you point out in the holographic universe is that this is a model that's been around now for a few decades, but it's really beginning to show its power in explaining many, many areas of personal experience and science at the same time. Can we talk a little bit about how the model developed?
Sure. It was developed by two men, University of London physicist named David Bohm, who was a former protege of Einstein, and a Stanford University neurophysiologist named Carl Pribram. And they worked independently. Pribram was studying memory and found that there's evidence that the brain operates holographically. And Bohm was studying subatomic physics and found that on the subatomic level, the fabric of reality seems to possess properties that are reminiscent of a hologram. So if you put those two ideas together, that our brain seems to be holographic and the universe is holographic, it suggests that maybe it's compelling evidence that the universe may be a kind of hologram, not that it's literally a hologram, but that it's a good metaphor or way of understanding the universe. If the universe is a hologram of some sense, in some way, it suggests that there may be 2 very drastically different levels to reality, that the concrete reality we see, you know, when we look at these chairs and at the, you know, the trees and the clouds and everything like that,
our bodies
are just one way that reality manifests, and that at some deep level there's a level of reality where everything dissolves into an ocean of energy that is holographically interconnected, where every portion of the universe is contained in every tiny area of the universe.
So that implies that this notion that we go about our everyday lives with thinking of ourselves as separate from each other, and the cup is separate from the coffee that goes in the cup, that these notions are somehow, what would you say, superficial or contradicted at a deeper level?
They're artificial, definitely, and Bohm really stresses this, and it's a very interesting notion, because in our Western way of thinking, we're so attached to the idea that when we come up with a concept like an apple or an electron or whatever, that exists out there, and we forget, it's kind of like fish unaware of the water in which they swim, that the conceptual pigeonholes we use, words, to describe reality are phenomena inside our head. They're not out there. And most of the time this is a philosophical quibble, but when you get down to quantum physics, and this is one of the reasons that Bohm came up with the holographic idea, it starts to have real effects. And one of those is it's been discovered that if you take 2 subatomic particles like electrons, that in certain instances, when you do something to one, it will always affect the other, no matter how far apart they are. It's kind of like stories that you've heard of identical twins, where when one is hurt, the other feels the pain. And the problem is that we can find no process known to physics that explains how these could be sending a signal back and forth. In fact,
because it would have to be faster than the speed of light.
Instantaneous. It would have to be an instantaneous signal, and Einstein's theory of relativity said you can't have instantaneous signals, because it would mean that you could violate the time barrier and conceivably call your grandfather and tell him not to marry your grandmother. And most physicists say, well, this would be just too troubling to incorporate into a rational picture of reality. Bohm explains it in a different way, which is a very interesting way, and he says, if you imagine that you've got an aquarium in which you have a fish swimming, you have a TV camera facing the front of the aquarium, one facing the side of the aquarium, and you have a monitor attached to each camera. Now you also imagine further that you come from a culture that's never seen aquariums, never seen fish, never seen monitors or cameras. All you are privy to is the 2 images on these screens. He says that maybe, you know, if you look at these 2 screens, you're going to see a side view of a fish and a frontal view of a fish. And because you don't know what the deeper reality is, the reality of the aquarium, you may assume that these are 2 separate things. But
2 different fish.
2 different fish, 2 different objects. But every time one fish moves, the other is going to make a corresponding movement. And you may then jump to the conclusion that somehow the one fish is signaling the other or communicating the other to say, hey, do this, instantaneously. And Bohm says this is what we've done with subatomic particles, that we assume that an instantaneous communication is going on, when that's not really what's going on at all. At a deeper level, a very holographic level of reality, every particle in the universe collapses to a sort of cosmic unity. They're not signaling each other. They're like that fish, where there's the level of the aquarium. And so
now this lies behind the whole problem that is discussed in the book Zen in the Art of Archery. The necessity of letting go of the bowstring without first deciding to do so. Another way of putting it is that the decision to release the bowstring and the action of doing so must be simultaneous. Not to decide and then act, but to act, decide all at once. Now, why is this? If you are going to be an expert archer, you must shoot before you think, otherwise it'll be too late. You don't aim and then shoot. It's all one action. And this is true likewise of any sort of shooting, pistol shooting as well. That if you aim, if you decide and then fire, you're apt to do things like pulling the trigger instead of squeezing. All kinds of wrong things are done. And you're always a moment too late if you decide first. You have to act and decide simultaneously. So what does that do, you see? That puts up a very curious problem, which in its own turn becomes a bind. To try and act quickly enough so that you overtake the preliminary decision. To try not to decide first. And that is an impossible problem. I wonder if you ever read von Kleist's story about the fighting bear. This is included in Nancy Wilson Ross's book, The World of Zen, as a kind of Western Zen. It's a story about a man who has a fight with a circus bear. And the bear reads his mind and always forestalls any attack that he makes on it. There's absolutely nothing he can do to get past the bear. And so, in the same way, you might imagine a guru who is a mind reader, and he always knows if you decide before you act. And if you do, you see, the devil will catch you. Instead, you see, of deciding that you won't be an alcoholic anymore, the only thing to do is not to drink, without any previous decision on this matter. But how can anyone do that, you see? That's the question. How can I decide not to decide? How can I announce that I won't make any announcement without making an announcement? You see, there is no way out of that bind. Try as you may, you go on and on and on, trying, as Herigel did, to release the bowstring without thinking first to release it. But then, strangely enough, one day the thing happened. He did it. And this is involved in our learning of almost all techniques. That we work and work to achieve that final point of perfection. And it doesn't come, and then one day it happens. Now, what is the reason for that? Is it simply, and this is really, you know, a way it's usually explained, but this is an oversimplification. It is not that we have practiced it so often that it suddenly becomes perfect. It is much more subtle than that. What happens is that we've practiced so often that we find out we can't do it. And it happens at the moment you know you can't do it. When you reach a certain point of despair, when you know that you are the one weird child who will never be able to swim. At that moment you're swimming. Because the desperation and the total inability to do it at all has brought you to a point which we might call don't care. You stop trying, you stop not trying to get it that way. You just have arrived at the insight that your decision, your will, doesn't have any part in the thing at all. And that's what you needed to know. You've overcome, you see, the illusion of having a separate ego.